The ancient cathedral bells tolled overhead, each resonant chime vibrating through my chest like a countdown to disaster. My trembling fingers clutched the simple bouquet of white lilies so tightly the stems bit into my palm, but the pain was nothing compared to the mounting dread coiling in my chest. Around me, murmurs rippled through St. Jude's, soft at first, then insistent, as the seconds dragged into impossible minutes. Mason was late. Then he was very late. Then he was simply not coming. "Vicky," my friend Sarah whispered beside me, her voice thick with pity that made my throat close. "Maybe we should. Just wait." I cut her off, the words barely audible. But even as I said it, I knew. Deep down, I knew. The text message I'd received 40 minutes earlier, the one I'd been too terrified to fully open, burned in my memory like a brand. "Can't do this, Vic. Can't take on that kind of responsibility. Not ready to be a father to someone else's kid. Responsibility." That's what my daughter had become in Mason's eyes. Not the brilliant, gentle child who had shyly called him Mason Dad just last week, but a burden, an obligation he decided, at the last possible moment, he couldn't shoulder. The murmurs grew louder. 67 guests, most of them Mason's colleagues and distant family who'd never bothered learning my name, shifted uncomfortably in the pews of St. Jude's Cathedral. The priest offered me a pitying look that made bile rise in my throat. "Maybe you should try calling him one more time," Sarah suggested quietly, though we both knew it was useless. I'd already called 19 times in the past 40 minutes. 19 times sent straight to voicemail. The cathedral's side door creaked open. My heart lurched painfully, desperately, but it was only my sister Emma slipping back inside from the vestibule, her face drawn and pale. She crossed me quickly, pressing a folded piece of paper into my hand. Hotel stationery, I noticed distantly. "Vicky, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "His best man just dropped this off. He's not coming." I didn't need to read it. The weight of Mason's absence pressed down on me like a physical thing, crushing the oxygen from my lungs. 3 years of grinding through life as a single mother, juggling 2 jobs and night classes, finally meeting someone who'd seemed to accept both me and Nora, all of it culminating in this perfect, public humiliation. The first tear escaped, cutting a hot path down my cheek and taking my carefully applied makeup with it. I'd spent 2 weeks' grocery money on that makeup artist, desperate to look beautiful, worthy, chosen for once in my life. "I need to get Nora," I managed, my voice fracturing. "I can't let her see me fall apart." I turned toward the front pew, my vision blurring, my hands already reaching for my daughter. And then the massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral burst open. Not creaked, not swung, burst. Before we continue, let us know in the comment section what time it is and where you are watching from. And remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. Now let's continue. A wave of impossible cold rolled down the center aisle, extinguishing the warmth from the stained glass afternoon light. Every candle flame guttered and nearly died. The temperature plummeted so drastically that my breath materialized in front of my face in a white cloud. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a collective gasp that sounded like the cathedral itself had inhaled in shock. I turned, my tear-stained face forgotten, my humiliation suddenly insignificant compared to the wrongness flooding the sacred space. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. No, not a man. Something other. He was impossibly tall, draped in black velvet that seemed to drink in the light around him. As he stepped forward with predatory grace, the golden glow from the stained glass illuminated skin so pale it was nearly luminous, bloodless, marble smooth, inhuman. His hair fell past his shoulders in a cascade of pure white, framing a face of devastating, terrible beauty. Ancient, powerful, wrong. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to grab Nora and flee, but I couldn't move. No one could. 67 guests sat frozen in their pews, mouths falling open in synchronized expressions of primal fear. The pale stranger's eyes found mine across the length of the cathedral. They were the color of winter itself, silver gray and utterly merciless. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the vaulted space with supernatural clarity, each word precise and absolutely final. "The mortal who abandoned you is mine." My heart stuttered.
Mine?
Mason Hartley served as my thrall for 3 years before he developed inconvenient delusions of freedom. His gaze never left my face as he closed the distance between us within human speed. He stole a sacred artifact from my coven and fled to your world, believing your mortality would shield him. He stopped 3 feet away. The cold radiating from him made my skin prickle with frost. "I don't." My voice cracked. "I don't know anything about." "I know." His tone held neither sympathy nor cruelty, only ancient certainty. "But you are his intended bond. That makes you valuable leverage to draw him out." He paused, his silver eyes assessing me with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Or you can serve a more immediate purpose." Behind me, Sarah made a small, terrified sound. The priest had backed against the altar, clutching his Bible like a shield. "Here is my offer, Victoria Blake." My name in his mouth sounded like a binding spell. "Marry me."
Now.
In this cathedral, before these witnesses. Accept my protection, and I will ensure your daughter never knows hunger, fear, or abandonment again. My blood turned to ice. "And if I refuse?" His expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature dropped another impossible degree. "Then I will tear this church apart, stone by stone, until I find what was stolen from me. And every soul within these walls will answer for harboring a thief's intended bride." His voice remained perfectly level, perfectly calm. "The choice, Victoria, is entirely yours." I looked past him to the doors, now sealed shut by some invisible force. Then to Nora, still sitting in the front pew, her small face pale with confusion and growing fear. There was no choice at all. "I have conditions." My voice sounded stronger than I felt, carried by a mother's desperate fury rather than courage. Ivric Thorne tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity on a human face, but looked predatory on his. "Speak them." "Nora stays human. You will never turn her, never harm her, never let your coven touch her." My hands were shaking so violently the bouquet trembled. "She gets a normal life. Education. Friends. A childhood." Agreed. The speed of his answer should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified me further. "And me," I continued, my voice dropping. "I stay human too, for as long as I live." Agreed. His silver eyes held mine. "You have my word, which, unlike your former fiancé's, is an unbreakable vow." "What else?" "Protection. Real protection. From Mason, from your coven, from whatever supernatural nightmare is out there that I don't even know exists yet. You will be under my direct protection as my consort. Any threat to you is a threat to me." He said it with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been challenged. No force in this world or any other would dare. I looked at Nora again. Her small fingers clutched the edge of the pew, her eyes wide and frightened but trusting. Trusting me to fix this.
To keep her safe.
"Then I accept." The words had barely left my lips when Ivric moved. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slender silver dagger that gleamed with an otherworldly light. The priest made a strangled sound and stumbled backward. Several guests screamed. "We require blood to seal the bond," Ivric said calmly, as if this were perfectly ordinary. A vampire marriage is not merely ceremonial. It is a magical contract, binding in all realms. He drew the blade across his palm without hesitation. Dark blood, too dark, nearly black, welled up immediately. Then he extended his other hand to me, palm up, waiting. I can't. You can." His voice was not unkind. For her. My eyes found Nora's again. My baby girl. My entire world. I placed my shaking hand in his. His skin was cold as death, smooth as marble. The dagger's edge was sharper than anything I'd ever felt. The pain was bright and immediate, but distant, as if happening to someone else. My blood against his darkness. Ivrik pressed our hands together. The moment our blood touched, the cathedral erupted in supernatural light. Silver flames burst from our joined hands, racing up our arms in intricate patterns that looked almost like ancient script. The temperature plummeted further. Frost spread across the stained glass windows in violent, beautiful fractals. I felt it then, the bond snapping into place like a lock clicking shut. Something fundamental shifted in my chest, a tether forming that stretched between us, unbreakable and eternal. By blood and vow, you are mine. Ivaric's voice resonated with power that made the cathedral walls tremble. By ancient law and binding magic, I claim you as consort, as bride, as queen of my domain. The silver flames intensified, and I heard myself scream, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of something foreign taking root in my very soul. Behind us, chaos erupted. Guests stampeded toward the exits, their screams echoing off vaulted ceilings. I saw Sarah grab Nora, pulling her back from the supernatural fire. My sister Emma had collapsed in her pew, unconscious. The priest was frantically making the sign of the cross, his prayers lost in the pandemonium. The flames died as suddenly as they'd appeared. I stood alone at the altar with a creature of legend, bound to him by magic I didn't understand, marked by a bond one could feel humming beneath my skin like a second heartbeat. It is done, Ivrik said quietly, releasing my hand. The cut had already sealed, leaving only a thin silver scar across my palm, identical to the one now marking his. You are the Vampire King's bride, Victoria, and nothing in heaven or hell can sever what we have made. The carriage that waited outside St. Jude's was not from this century. Polished black lacquer gleamed in the fading sunlight, ornate silver fixtures catching the light like captured stars. No horses stood in the traces. The vehicle simply existed, waiting with supernatural patience. Nora pressed against my side, her small hand gripping mine with desperate strength. Sarah had managed to calm her during the chaos, but my daughter's eyes were too wide, too knowing. She'd seen things no 6-year-old should ever witness. It will convey you safely, Ivrik said, opening the carriage door with unsettling courtesy. The interior was velvet and shadow, smelling faintly of night-blooming flowers and something ancient I couldn't name. I wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but the silver scar on my palm pulsed with warmth, reminding me of the unbreakable bond now tethering me to this creature. I climbed inside, pulling Nora onto my lap. The journey defied physics. We moved through the city streets, but the scenery outside the windows blurred and shifted in ways that made my stomach turn. Buildings melted into forests. Forests gave way to mountains I knew didn't exist within 100 miles of the city. Reality itself seemed negotiable. Nora buried her face in my chest, whimpering softly. I held her tighter, murmuring meaningless reassurances even as my own terror threatened to choke me. When the carriage finally stopped, we'd arrived somewhere impossible. The estate rose before us like something from a nightmare wrapped in dark beauty. Ancient stone, towering spires, windows that glowed with pale light against the perpetual twilight that seemed to hang over the grounds. Mist clung to everything, giving the entire scene a dreamlike quality that made me question my own sanity. "Welcome to Thornhaven," Ivrik said, offering his hand to help me down. I ignored it, stepping out on my own, still clutching Nora. The entrance hall was vast and cold. Cathedral ceilings soared overhead, lost in shadow. Chandeliers dripped with crystals that chimed softly in a wind I couldn't feel. Everything was beautiful and terrible and wrong. 3 figures waited in the hall, 2 women and 1 man, all inhumanly beautiful, all watching me with eyes that held centuries of calculation. They wore period clothing from different eras, as if they'd simply stopped bothering to keep up with mortal fashion at some point in their long existences. Mrs. Calloway oversees the household, Ivric said, gesturing to a woman in Victorian-era dress whose auburn hair was pulled into a severe bun. She will attend to your needs. Mrs. Calloway's smile didn't reach her ancient eyes. Welcome, my lady. We've prepared quarters befitting the king's consort. Her gaze dropped to Nora, and something flickered in her expression. Not quite warmth, but perhaps a distant memory of it. And the child, of course. The East Wing has been warded specifically for them, one of the other vampires said, his accent vaguely Slavic. No one may enter without the king's explicit permission. Not even us. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like being told the dimensions of my cage. Ivric led us through corridors that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, past rooms filled with treasures from ages I could only guess at. Finally, he stopped before an ornate door carved with protective symbols that seemed to pulse with faint light. Your sanctuary, he said simply, pushing it open. The suite beyond was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, enormous windows overlooking gardens that glowed with bioluminescent flowers, furniture that looked antique and priceless. One room had been transformed into a child's paradise. Toys I recognized from Nora's wish lists, books, art supplies, even a small canopy bed draped in gauzy fabric that sparkled like starlight. Nora will want for nothing, Ivric said, watching my daughter's odd expression. There are tutors available, magical protections on every surface, wards against nightmares woven into the very walls. I walked to the window, looking out at the impossible gardens, the mist-shrouded grounds, the eternal twilight. Beautiful.
Secure.
Utterly isolated. This is a prison, I whispered. This, Ivric corrected softly from behind me, is the safest place in any realm. You asked for protection, Victoria. I have given you absolute sanctuary.
He was right.
And that knowledge settled over me like a shroud. I was safer than I'd ever been in my life. And I'd never been more trapped. I waited until Nora finally fell asleep, exhausted by terror and wonder in equal measure. Mrs. Calloway had provided warm milk laced with something herbal and soothing. I'd watched her prepare it myself, trusting nothing in this place. Once my daughter's breathing deepened into sleep, I slipped from our gilded cage and went hunting for answers. The castle seemed to anticipate my intent. Corridors that had twisted incomprehensibly during our arrival now formed a direct path. I followed the pull of the bond humming beneath my ribs, that silver thread connecting me to the creature I'd been forced to marry. It led me to a door of dark wood, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I didn't knock. I'd earned the right to answers. Iveric's study was exactly what I'd expected, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with ancient volumes, a massive desk covered in maps and documents written in languages I didn't recognize, windows overlooking the mist-wrapped grounds. He stood by the fireplace, still wearing the black velvet from the cathedral, looking like he'd stepped out of a Gothic painting. He didn't turn when I entered. You should be resting. Tell me the truth. My voice was steadier than I felt. All of it. What did I actually agree to? A blood bond marriage. I was quite clear. You were clear about nothing. I moved closer, anger overriding fear. You threatened to murder everyone in that church, forced me into some kind of magical contract, and dragged us to this impossible place. I deserve to know exactly what you've made me. Finally, he turned. Those silver eyes assessed me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Very well.
Seat.
I'll stand. The ghost of something amusement, respect, flickered across his features. The marriage bond is not symbolic, Victoria. It is a magical covenant recognized by every supernatural power in existence. By binding yourself to me through blood and vow, you are now cloaked in my protection. Any creature that wishes you harm must go through me first." He paused. "And no one is foolish enough to challenge a vampire king." "Why me?" The question tore out of me. "You said Mason stole from you."
Fine.
"But why force me into this? There must be other ways to—" "There are not." His voice hardened. "Mason Hartley took the Sanguis Stone, an artifact of immense power that can only be tracked through bonds of blood and intention. You were his intended bride. That creates a sympathetic link I can exploit to locate him, but only if you're protected from the magical backlash such tracking would cause to an unmarried mortal." The clinical explanation should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me feel like a tool, a means to an end. "How long have you known about me?" Silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge. 8 months. "I've been watching since Mason first approached you." 8 months. My entire relationship with Mason had been observed by this ancient creature. "I watched you work yourself to exhaustion for that child," he continued quietly. "2 jobs, night classes, still finding time to read her stories before bed. I watched Mason fail you repeatedly, missed promises, forgotten commitments, and yet you persisted, believing he would eventually become what you needed him to be." Heat flushed my cheeks. "You had no right." "I had every right. He was my thrall, my property, and he was playing house with a mortal while plotting to betray me." Ivrik moved closer, and I forced myself not to retreat. But what intrigued me, Victoria, was not his deception. It was your resilience, your absolute refusal to break, no matter how heavy the burden. "So, you decided to add another burden?" Bitterness leaked into my voice. "How generous." "I decided you deserved better than a coward who would abandon you at the altar." His hand lifted, and I flinched, but he merely gestured to the silver scar on my palm. "This bond is eternal. It cannot be broken by death, distance, or time. In the supernatural world, it is the most sacred commitment that exists, far more binding than any mortal marriage." I stared at the scar, feeling the warmth pulsing from it. I didn't want eternal. I just wanted safe. "Now you have both." He turned back to the window. "For better or worse, Victoria Blake, you are the Vampire King's bride, and I take care of what is mine." The possessiveness in his tone should have terrified me. Instead, for the first time since Mason's text message, I felt something other than fear. I felt chosen. The lawyer arrived 3 days after our binding, summoned by Ivrik to formalize the arrangements. His name was Cornelius Sharp, and he looked like he'd been ancient when Rome fell. He wore a perfectly tailored 3-piece suit from the 1920s and carried a leather portfolio that smelled of age and dark magic. We met in Thornhaven's formal dining room. Me, Ivrik, and this creature who'd probably drafted contracts for emperors and tyrants across millennia. "Mrs. Thorne," Cornelius began, his voice like whined through dead leaves. He spread documents across the mahogany table, each written in flowing script that seemed to shift between languages as I watched. "These are the terms of your union, as ratified by the Council of Elders and recognized across all supernatural territories." I glanced at Ivrik, who sat at the head of the table with unreadable composure. "I can't read any of this." "I will translate." Cornelius tapped the first document with a finger tipped in a yellowed nail. "As consort to the Vampire King, you are granted absolute immunity from coven law. No vampire, regardless of age or rank, may compel, harm, or feed from you without facing immediate execution." The casual mention of execution made my stomach turn. "Your daughter, Nora Blake, is similarly protected under a blood-sealed covenant." He indicated a second document that glowed faintly with golden light. "She will receive full financial support, education, housing, medical care, all necessities and reasonable luxuries until her natural death. This provision is magically enforced and cannot be revoked, even by the king himself. Even by Ivrik. The implications settled over me. Nora's security didn't depend on my continued cooperation. It was guaranteed, permanent, unbreakable. You will receive a monthly allowance of 50,000 in your currency of choice, Cornelius continued. Access to the king's resources for personal use, within reason. Full autonomy over your daily activities, with the sole restriction being you may not permanently leave the estate grounds without the king's escort, for your own protection. So, I'm a prisoner with a generous stipend, I said flatly. You're a queen with appropriate security measures, Cornelius corrected without inflection. Enough. Ivaric's voice cut through the tension. He waved a dismissive hand at the lawyer. Leave the documents. I'll ensure she understands the remaining terms. Cornelius bowed, actually bowed, and departed with supernatural silence, leaving us alone with a pile of incomprehensible contracts. I stood abruptly, chair scraping against stone. I won't be controlled like one of your thralls, Ivrik. I don't care how powerful you are or what magical leash you've tied around my soul. I'm still a person. I still have autonomy. I know. His calmness was infuriating. I'll make my own decisions about Nora's upbringing, about how I spend my time, about everything that matters. You can't just dictate.
Victoria.
He rose, moving around the table with that predatory grace. I don't want a thrall. I have dozens of those, and they bore me immensely. I backed up instinctively. He stopped, giving me space. What I want, he continued quietly, is a queen. Someone with the strength to stand beside me, not cower behind me. Someone who will challenge me when I'm wrong and celebrate with me when I'm right. His silver eyes held mine. Someone exactly like the woman who stormed into my study 3 nights ago and demanded answers. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. The bond between us is eternal, he said, gesturing to my palm where the scar gleamed. Our souls are tied across all realms and lifetimes. But your body, Victoria, that remains yours and yours alone. Heat crept up my neck. I don't understand. The physical consummation of our marriage will happen only when if you choose it. His expression remained carefully neutral. I will not compel you, seduce you through supernatural means, or use the bond to manipulate your desire. When you come to me, it will be of your own free will, or not at all. I stared at him, searching for deception, for the trap hidden in his words. Why? Because, he said simply, I have lived for over 1,000 years, and I have never wanted anything I had to force into existence. He turned toward the door, pausing at the threshold. You have all the time in the world to decide, Victoria. I am patient, and I am certain. He left me standing there, surrounded by magical contracts and impossible promises, wondering how Monster could make me feel more respected than any mortal man ever had. 6 months passed like a dream I couldn't wake from, though I was no longer certain I wanted to. Nora adapted with the terrifying resilience of childhood. Within weeks, her nightmares faded. Within a month, she was exploring Thornhaven's endless corridors with fearless curiosity. By the 3rd month, she'd given Ivrik a nickname that made the ancient vampire king visibly pause the first time she used it. Uncle Ivrik, look. She'd run up to him in the library, clutching a book on constellations that was probably worth more than my former apartment. Mrs. Calloway says these stars don't exist in the mortal sky anymore. Is that true? He'd knelt, actually knelt, to her level, examining the page she indicated with solemn attention. Quite true. That constellation died 3,000 years ago. But here, in the eternal night, we remember what was lost. That's sad, Nora said thoughtfully, but also beautiful. Something shifted in his expression then, something almost tender.
Yes.
It is both. I watched from the doorway, my heart doing complicated things I wasn't ready to examine. This creature, who'd threatened to raise a church, now patiently explained stellar death to my daughter with genuine respect for her 6-year-old philosophical musings. The tutors he'd provided were exceptional: a retired Oxford professor for literature, a mathematician who'd apparently taught in ancient Alexandria, a music instructor who claimed to have known Mozart personally. Nora flourished under their attention, her natural brightness finally given room to shine without the constant anxiety of instability. As for me, Ivrik had different plans. "You are consort to a king," he'd said that first week, leading me to a study lined with texts that predated the printing press. "You must understand the world you now inhabit." The lessons began simply: basic supernatural history, the hierarchy of the various species, the ancient laws that govern their interactions. But Ivrik quickly realized I absorbed information like parched earth drinking rain, and the curriculum evolved. We spent evenings in his private study, texts spread between us, debating the finer points of coven politics or the evolution of magical theory across centuries. He taught me dead languages, Latin, ancient Greek, something called Old Covenant that made my tongue feel strange forming the syllables. "You have a gift for this," he said one night, reviewing my translation of a particularly complex treaty. "Most mortals struggle with the conceptual frameworks. You grasp them intuitively. I was working on my master's degree before. I stopped, the memory of my abandoned education suddenly sharp. Before Mason's cowardice interrupted your plans." Ivarik's voice held an edge of contempt whenever he mentioned my former fiancé. "You were studying political science, correct? International relations." I ran my fingers over the ancient text, feeling the weight of knowledge it contained. "I wanted to work in diplomacy. Thought I could make a difference somehow." "You still can." He leaned back in his chair, regarding me with that unsettling intensity. "The supernatural world is built on treaties, alliances, and carefully negotiated peace. Your skills are perhaps more valuable here than they ever would have been in the mortal realm." It should have felt like patronizing comfort. Instead, it felt like recognition. The strangest part was how reliable he was. Every promise made, kept. Every boundary set, respected. Nora's tutoring, my financial independence, the physical distance he maintained despite the bond humming constantly between us, all honored with absolute, ancient consistency. I found myself comparing him to Mason constantly, and the comparison was damning. Mason, who'd promised stability and delivered abandonment. Mason, who'd claimed to love Nora but called her a burden. Mason, who'd sworn vows he had no intention of keeping. Ivrik, who'd threatened and coerced and bound me with supernatural force, and then kept every single promise with unwavering certainty. "You're scowling at that manuscript," Ivrik observed, pulling me from my thoughts. "Is the translation troubling you?"
No.
I met his gaze across the desk. "I was just thinking how strange it is to trust a vampire more than I ever trusted a human." His expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in those silver eyes. "Trust is earned through actions, not words. I have had a millennium to learn that lesson." "And I've had 6 months," I said quietly. "But I'm learning it too." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the eternal twilight painted the gardens in shades of silver and shadow. I was learning a great many things in my gilded cage. And the most terrifying realization was that I was no longer certain I wanted the door to open. I found him in the archives 3 levels below the main castle, surrounded by texts so ancient the air itself seemed heavy with their accumulated years. He stood before a viewing table, examining what looked like a star map rendered in ink that shimmered like liquid silver. "It's past midnight," I said, descending the final steps into the circular chamber. "Time is relative when one has an eternity of it." He didn't look up from the map. "You should be sleeping. So should you." "I don't sleep, Victoria. Not as you understand it." I moved closer, drawn by curiosity and something else I wasn't ready to name. The map showed constellations I didn't recognize, with notations in that old covenant language he'd been teaching me. What is this? A navigation chart. From before. His finger traced a pattern that no longer existed in any sky. I'm trying to calculate where Mason might have fled. The Sanguis stone creates distortions in magical currents, and if I can map the anomalies. He stopped abruptly as I leaned over the table beside him, our shoulders nearly touching. The bond flared warm beneath my skin, responding to proximity with an intensity that made my breath catch. You're close, he said quietly, though he made no move to step away. The notation here, I pointed to a symbol, trying to ignore the way my pulse hammered. That's the marker for temporal displacement, isn't it? You think he's hiding in a pocket realm? Ivrik turned his head, and suddenly we were inches apart. Those silver eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt physical. You've been studying. You're an excellent teacher. My voice came out softer than intended. The air between us thickened with something dangerous and electric. I could see the precise moment he registered my elevated heartbeat, the flush creeping up my neck, the way I swayed infinitesimally closer despite every rational thought screaming at me to retreat.
Victoria.
My name was a warning and a question. I'm not afraid of you anymore, I whispered. The realization shocked me even as I spoke it. I should be. You're a 1,000-year-old vampire who forced me into a magical marriage. But I'm not. Then you're a fool. But his hand lifted, hovering near my face, without quite touching. I am exactly as dangerous as you feared.
No.
I shook my head slightly. You're dangerous, yes. But not to me. Not to Nora. You've had 6 months to prove your monstrousness, and instead you've given us. My voice cracked unexpectedly. You've given us everything. His expression shifted, ancient control cracking to reveal something raw beneath. I gave you what you were owed, what any being under my protection deserves. Mason promised me stability and delivered humiliation. You threatened me with violence and delivered safety, education, security, respect. The emotions I'd been suppressing for months suddenly surged forward. Nora laughs now. Really laughs. She's not afraid of being evicted or going hungry or losing another father figure. She sleeps through the night without nightmares. Do you understand what that means to me?
Victoria.
You called her brilliant last week when she solved that astronomical equation. You remembered she doesn't like rosemary and told Mrs. Calloway to adjust the evening meals. You had that entire wing converted into an art studio because she mentioned once that she liked painting. Tears burned behind my eyes. You've been more of a father to her in 6 months than any man has been in her entire life. Ivaric's hand finally made contact, his cool fingers brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. The touch sent electricity racing through me. Your capacity for love terrifies me, he said softly. The fierceness of it, the absolute unwavering devotion you have for that child. I have witnessed empires rise and fall, watched stars die and new ones born, but I have never encountered anything as powerful as a mother's love. Is that why you watched me? For 8 months, before the wedding. I watched because I couldn't look away. His thumb traced my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Because you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders and still found the strength to read bedtime stories with voices for all the characters. Because you were the most mortal creature I'd ever seen and the most magnificent. The space between us had disappeared. I could feel the cold radiating from him, see the way his carefully controlled expression was fracturing, revealing hunger and longing and something that looked dangerously close to reverence. Thank you, I breathed, for keeping your promises, for protecting her, for seeing us as more than leverage. You were never just leverage. His voice had gone rough. Not from the moment I first saw you. I rose on my toes, closing the final distance, and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, entirely my choice, and it changed everything. The summons came 3 weeks after the kiss in the archives. 3 weeks of careful distance, of Ivrik retreating into formal politeness that felt like ice water after the warmth of that moment. He'd been avoiding me, I realized, and that terrified me more than his initial threats ever had. Mrs. Calloway delivered the message herself, her ancient eyes unreadable. The king requests your presence in the Eastern Tower. Immediately. The walk through Thornhaven's corridors felt endless. The bond beneath my ribs pulled taut with each step, humming with an urgency that made my hands shake. Something was wrong. Something was ending. The Eastern Tower was a part of the castle I'd never entered, older than the rest, built from stone that predated modern civilization. The door stood open, revealing a circular chamber lit by hundreds of candles arranged in precise geometric patterns. Ivrik stood at the center of an intricate ritual circle drawn in what looked like molten silver. The symbols were unlike anything I'd studied, complex and layered and radiating power that made my skin prickle. He wore black robes I'd never seen before, formal and ritualistic, his white hair unbound and falling past his shoulders. He looked like a king, like a sorcerer, like something utterly beyond my mortal comprehension.
Victoria.
He didn't turn as I entered. Close the door. I obeyed, my heart thundering. What is this? A severance ritual. His voice was carefully controlled, devoid of emotion. I've spent the past 3 weeks researching, consulting with the oldest practitioners of magical law. This circle, he gestured to the intricate design surrounding him, can break our bond.
Cleanly. Completely.
As if it never existed. The world tilted. What? You would return to your mortal life with Nora. Fully human, fully free. Finally, he turned to face me, and the devastation in his silver eyes stole my breath. I've established a trust fund, 50 million in accessible currency. Nora's education secured through any institution she chooses. A home, wherever you wish. Protection spells woven around you both that will last your natural lifetimes, preventing any supernatural entity from ever approaching you again. I don't understand. My voice came out broken. Why? Because I can no longer bear it. The careful control cracked, revealing raw anguish beneath. I forced you into this bond, Victoria. Threatened you in a moment of desperation and vulnerability. I bound you to me through fear and coercion, and every day since, that knowledge has been poison. You kept your promises. Promises made under duress are not promises. His shout echoed off ancient stone. They are chains dressed in pretty words. And he stopped, visibly struggling. I have lived 1,000 years without conscience, without regret. But these past months, watching you smile at me across the dinner table, listening to you debate philosophy with genuine passion, feeling you kiss me in the archives as if I were worthy of such tenderness. His voice broke completely. I cannot keep you in a cage, no matter how gilded. Not when he drew a shuddering breath. Not when I love you. The confession hung in the candlelit air like a sacred thing. I want your choice, Victoria. Your true, uncoerced, completely free choice. He stepped to the edge of the circle, as close as the ritual would allow. If you walk through the circle, the bond breaks. You and Nora leave tonight with everything I promised. You'll never see me again, never be touched by the supernatural world. You'll be free. Tears streamed down my face. And if I don't walk through, then I will know. His hands clenched at his sides. I will know that you choose this. Choose me. Not because I threatened a church full of innocents, not because you were desperate and afraid, but because you want this impossible life we've built. You're giving me an exit. The realization was overwhelming. After everything, you're letting me go. I am offering you freedom. His eyes held mine with desperate intensity. Because loving you means wanting your happiness more than my own desires. Even if your happiness means I lose you forever. The ritual circle pulsed with waiting power. One step, and I could reclaim the normal life I'd always wanted. Safety, without supernatural complications. A future for Nora free from vampires and blood bonds and ancient magic. Everything I'd thought I needed. I looked at Ivrik, this impossible creature who'd become my intellectual equal, my protector, my partner, who'd kept every promise with absolute reliability, who'd learned to love my daughter as fiercely as I did, who was willing to destroy himself to give me freedom. And I finally understood what I actually wanted. I stood at the edge of the ritual circle, feeling the power radiating from the molten silver symbols like heat from a forge. One step. That's all it would take. One step, and I could reclaim the life I'd planned. Modest apartment, steady job, normal schools for Nora, Sunday morning pancakes without the looming presence of immortal creatures. Safe, predictable, mortal, empty. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. That life, the one I'd fought so desperately to build with Mason, had never been about what I wanted. It had been about survival, about clinging to the illusion of stability in a world that had never once been stable for me. I'd been settling, accepting crumbs and calling it a feast. Victoria. Ivaric's voice was strained, carefully neutral despite the anguish in his eyes. You don't have to decide this moment.
Take time.
Think about. I spent 3 years thinking with Mason. I interrupted, my voice stronger than I felt. 3 years convincing myself that adequate was enough. That I should be grateful for anyone willing to tolerate my circumstances. I took a step, not through the circle, but along its edge, moving closer to where he stood. Do you know what he said to me once? That I should be more realistic about my expectations. That single mothers don't get fairy tales. Ivaric's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He was right. I continued, circling closer. I don't get a fairy tale. Fairy tales are safe, predictable stories where princes are charming and the happily ever after comes with a white picket fence. I stopped at the circle's edge, close enough to see the silver flecks in his eyes, the barely controlled hope warring with resignation on his ancient face. But I don't want a fairy tale anymore, Ivrik. I want this. This impossible, terrifying, magical reality where my daughter calls a vampire king Uncle Ivrik and debates astronomy with 1,000-year-old tutors. Where I spend my evenings translating dead languages with someone who actually values my mind as much as my presence. Victoria, his voice was raw, breaking. Where I kiss a man, a vampire, in dusty archives and feel more desired, more seen, more cherished than I ever felt with someone who is supposed to love me. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't look away. You forced me into this bond, yes. But somewhere along the way, I chose to stay. I chose this life. I chose you. You can still choose freedom, he said desperately, even as hope kindled in his expression. You deserve the choice. I am choosing. I lifted my foot, hovering over the ritual circle's boundary. I'm choosing eternity over freedom. I'm choosing the vampire king who keeps his promises over the mortal man who broke them. I'm choosing the monster who loves my daughter over the human who called her a burden. I stepped forward, not through the circle, but into it, crossing the threshold toward him rather than away. The ritual collapsed instantly. Silver light exploded outward, symbols dissolving into harmless sparks that danced through the air like fireflies. The severing magic dissipated, its purpose abandoned, leaving only the eternal bond between us, stronger now, pulsing with recognition and fierce joy. Ivrik caught me as I reached him, his arms coming around me with desperate strength. You're certain? Absolutely certain? Because once I accept this, once I allow myself to believe. I choose you, I said firmly, framing his face with my hands, feeling the cool smoothness of his skin against my palms. I choose this bond. I choose eternity. I choose. He kissed me before I could finish, and it was nothing like the tentative brush of lips in the archives. This was claiming, celebrating, 1,000 years of loneliness ending in a single perfect moment. The bond sang between us, no longer a chain but a symphony. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard despite his lack of need for air, his forehead rested against mine. "My queen," he whispered, "the title of vow. My choice. My eternity. Your extremely stubborn mortal wife who's going to challenge every autocratic decision you make." I corrected, breathless and giddy and absolutely certain. His laugh was pure joy, unfettered and genuine. I would expect nothing less. Far below in her protected suite, Nora slept peacefully, dreaming child dreams in the safest place in any realm. Above us, the eternal twilight painted the sky in shades of silver and shadow. And between us, an impossible bond, forged in desperation, tempered in respect, and finally, gloriously, chosen in love. I had walked into St. Jude's Cathedral expecting a modest wedding to a mediocre man. I walked out of the Eastern Tower as the eternal queen of the vampire court, bound to a creature of legend who valued my choice above his own desires. It wasn't the life I'd planned. It was infinitely better. "Take me to bed, husband," I said, the word deliberate and claiming. "Our eternity starts now." Ivaric's smile was devastating, full of promise and passion and forever. As my queen commands, he swept me into his arms, and as we left the tower chamber, the failed severance ritual dissolving into nothing behind us, I realized I was no longer afraid of the dark. I had chosen to rule it instead. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, drop your favorite scene in the comments, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story is already waiting in the shadows. Thanks for watching.